Hello, Sandra, and hello,
Uh,
everyone. Thanks for joining. Um, okay, so first off, I want to send out a big thanks to Roke from Clemex. I'm not sure if Roke's in the meeting or not yet. He was the one that came up with this topic, and I think it's a really interesting topic. We should have some fun with this today. And I want to encourage you to send topics. If you have something that you'd like to know more about, probably someone else does too. So you can always send a topic to support@xenix.com, and in return, we'll send you a t-shirt. So please think about that. We do these every quarter, and I think the next one that's coming up is going to be in December. We don't have a date yet, and that's going to be all about test data and the different places where you can store your test data. And I think there's probably going to be some things that are surprising even for folks that have used AscentialTest for a long time. But today's topic is all about flaky tests. And so let me get right into that. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about debugging techniques, because if you've got a flaky test, well, chances are you're going to have to debug it and try to figure out why it's flaky. I'll talk about how you can write clear error messages. That's really important because it helps you debug if you've always presented a clear error message. I'm going to talk about caching, which is something that maybe some of you don't know a whole lot about. I'm also going to talk about synchronization techniques, because I think 9 times out of 10 when we have a flaky test, it probably has something to do with synchronization. And then 3 customers have provided some solutions, so I'll be talking about those toward the end of the presentation. And then I'm going to give you a little preview about some new features that are coming up in the next version of AscentialTest. So let's talk a little bit about debugging. As I go through this topic of debugging, I'm going to talk about the trace, the results trace. I'll talk about the call stack. I'll talk about how you can use snapshots in your results in order to help you debug. I'm going to talk about the debugging class, which maybe some of you don't know anything about. I'll talk about running a single action in its context, halting, pausing test execution. And a couple of the topics, I'm going to show you the temporary way that we do it now, and then give you the new way you're going to be able to do it. So let's talk about the results trace first. And by the way, I will save plenty of time at the end for questions. So the results trace, you probably know that this is from a plan and this is from a test, but it's the exact same test. And if you study this, you can see the results trace is exactly the same. It's just where I ran the test from. So this test was run from a plan, and this test was run from the test editor itself. But I want to point out a number of things about the trace. Now, of course, the trace traces everything that was actually done as the test was executed. So you can see every single action that occurred. If it's a GUI action, you might know that if it's a UA action, it doesn't get recorded here, which is kind of a deficit. That's something that I would like to add to the trace at some point. But right now, it's only what UA server is doing, not what AscentialTest is doing in Z necessarily. So all of your UA, your GUI steps are all traced here. This is a relatively new feature, as you know, where we have the steps that are actually specified in bold, and you can expand and collapse them. And that was a nice addition because it kind of helps you figure out where you are. If you can imagine the trace without the steps, it's just a whole series of blue lines, and it's a little bit difficult to kind of get your place. Whereas the steps are kind of like placeholders or bookmarks, really. They kind of help you get an orientation to where you are in the trace. Every action is actually traced, as I said. So I'm just kind of talking about all the arrows right now. And sometimes you'll see a line that has a little camera. Well, that means that there's a snapshot that's been embedded into the results file. Now, how might that get embedded? Well, automatically, if there's an error, AscentialTest will take a snapshot and embed it. So for example, if you tried to click on a button and the button was not there, you're going to get a call stack, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, and you're going to get one of these icons so that you can click on the icon, put it alongside of your results file and figure out, well, why wasn't that found in this context at runtime? But there's other ways that you can get those in there, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. And then, of course, if there's a verify, you might see this little icon here. And if I were live and I double click that, you'd see the difference viewer pop up, and it would show you what you expected and what you got. So that's just a summary of what's in the results trace. And of course, if I switch over to the other side, I'm running it from a test, it's the exact same trace. There's really no differences. Now let's talk about the call stack, and I've been surprised that sometimes people don't know about this. I looked at the attendance, and so I think most of you do. But if you don't, here's an example of when you get an error, and this is exactly what I was talking about, where you tried to maybe click on something or select something, and you got a message that says the object isn't found. Well, typically when that occurs, you get the camera icon, and if I double clicked it, the snapshot would open. And then we've got this call stack here, and this is the part that I think maybe not everybody does know. When you see the call stack underneath the error, you can put your cursor on a line, and in this case I'm only showing you one line, but if it was called from somewhere else, there could be multiple lines. And it starts from like inner to outer. So if it was like if this was the step, and then if it was called from a test, there'd be another line. But if you take your cursor and you double click on that line, excuse me, losing my voice already, gonna get a sip of water here. If you double click on the line, then the AscentialTest will navigate right to the line where the error occurred. So that helps you with your debugging. So this call stack is very, very useful. Now, I talked about how you can get those little camera icons into the results file. Aside from when AscentialTest does it automatically when it can't find an object, there's other ways that those little icons can show up. Now, and again, some of this might be new to you, even if you've used AscentialTest for a while. Now, you can always call UA snapshot. You can put that anywhere in your test. So if you want to have pictures of what's going on in your test, you can always insert a UA log snapshot. This parameter here is an optional parameter, and that's whether or not you want AscentialTest to take a new snapshot or use the existing snapshot, the current state of the screen or page. So that's what that's all about. Now you know that there's also something called save snapshot. That's different. If you call UA.save snapshot, it doesn't put it in your results file. What it does is it saves it to a file, which you can then, open separately. You can open that in AscentialTest, and you might use that if you're going to be extracting images. Maybe you're building your help for your product or documentation or training or something like that. That's where I know I've seen people use save snapshot, where they're just saving a whole bunch of snapshots so that later on they can go through and extract PNGs from those snapshots for documentation purposes. But this is different. This is the log snapshot, which embeds it into the results file, like we were looking at, putting the little camera icon there. There's two different versions of it. There's the UA log snapshot, which will get the entire page or screen, or you can call it on an object, and then it'll only take a snapshot of that object. So there's a difference here. The snapshot's going to look different. Again, this is going to get the whole screen, snapshot everything that's hooked. this is going to snapshot only the object that it's called on. Now here's where you might be learning something new. I don't know if you've maybe never looked, but when you do a verify value, the optional parameter, which is set to false, can be switched to true, so that if the verify value fails, it takes a snapshot. Likewise, the other types of verify, this is the verify value where you're just verifying the expected versus the actual, and we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail in just a sec. But then you've got these other verify values. They can look like this, or they can look like this. If you use the actions panel and you dragged over a verify, it's probably going to look like this. Well, again, it has this parameter where you can, I'm sorry, this one has the parameter where you can turn on the snapshot or not turn it on. And I believe it's off by default. So you have to set that to true. But if it's a verify like this, there is no optional parameter. So you might wonder, well, how do I do that? Well, you do that from project settings, runtime defaults, log snapshot when verify fails. So that's what this checkbox is for. If you check that, whenever you do one of these kind of verifies, the standard verify that is had from the actions panel, you don't have the ability to turn it on or off here. You do it here through this checkbox. If you check that checkbox, anytime you do one of these verifies, if the verify fails, you will get one of those snapshots automatically. It wouldn't surprise me if someone who's listening doesn't know that, because it's not a feature that I talk about very much, but it's good to know. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the debugging class. Again, this might be new to some folks out there. Now, this is going to get enhanced considerably in the next release, and I'll be talking about that in just a few minutes. So we have a debug class. This is in AscentialTest right now. And if you were to take from the actions panel and drag and drop, and if you ran the test, you'd see that debug print global variables will print your global variables. So here in my little example, I've got a print statement that says these are my globals, and I did create a global variable in my project, which is not something I do very often, but I did. I created it just so I'd have an example. I had a Boolean that I set to true. And then these are my local variables. Now you notice I have an input parameter to my step, and I then am going to assign that to a local variable. So I've got two variables. We consider the parameter local. The input parameter is local. And then this is local. And so you can see that both name and first name are set to James. So when I ran this test, it prompted me, because it was a parameter when I ran this step, and I keyed in James, and so you got James and James. So again, local variables are those that are input parameters and those that are local to the step or test, whereas your globals are things that you might put right in test.z or in your common.z if you have one, that kind of thing. And so by dragging these in, you could then, in your trace of your test, you can always see what the values of your global and local variables are. Now again, this is going to get enhanced very soon because we're going to have a breakpoint, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, a lot of times when you work with support and we're trying to help you debug something, we might say to you, well, just run that single line, because you want to try to figure out, is there a problem with the action itself, or is the problem only when the action is part of the rest of the step or the test? in which case, probably points to synchronization or something like that. So running a single action in its context is kind of helping us narrow down what might be this flakiness that we're experiencing. So typically, if you've worked with me, I'll say to you, well, let's just comment out everything else and let's just try to run, the action or actions where the problem is occurring. So you can always right-click on lines and select comment and just comment them out so that you can run them. Now, we're going to have a better way of doing that in the near future where you won't have to comment out. Now, you can always halt a test. So if, right now, because we don't have a breakpoint, if you were running a test and, things are happening really quickly and you can't kind of figure out what's going on, you could always put a long sleep in there so that you can see what's going on. I didn't think of that until just now. You can drag over a long sleep so that you can watch. Of course, you can always slow down the execution by going into the runtime defaults and, slowing it down. You can do that as well. You can say, you'll be surprised if you put a 1 second on the value for the slowing down the keyboard and the mouse. 1 second is a long time. You'll see those tests run a whole lot less quickly. I'll point that out afterwards since I don't have a slide on that. But if you want to actually halt the test at a certain point, you can come over to your Actions Explorer, and under your statement exceptions, you can always drag over a throw, and then I just simply put in here, stop the test. Now, if I was to be running this test and it got to this line, it would stop the test right there. And now, because we don't have a breakpoint, you can't halt and resume. That would be the end of the test, right? Now, again, this is going to change very soon. The other thing that I'm surprised I actually didn't come up with this sooner, but I did come up with this a few months ago. If you want to pause a test because you just want to see what's going on, you want to check on maybe your database or something like that, the state of the application, and you can do this today. You can always take a manual step here and drag it and drop it right into your test, temporarily. And then just for demonstration purposes, I keyed in the instruction that says, click the pass step button, which is this button here, to resume the execution. So in a way, there has always been a way to set a breakpoint in AscentialTest because you could drag the manual step in here, and that will pause the execution until you pass. Or, you could abort the whole thing if you want to or fail the step, but that would end the execution. That would be like a halt. But if you just wanted to pause, you would just pass the step and then the test would continue running. I say this is temporary because very soon you're going to have a breakpoint that you can drag in. We started actually working on that the last couple of days, and the virtual machine is already done. The only thing we have left to do is the GUI. So once the GUI is done, we'll be able to put that into the next release. Now, writing a clear error message is always really important to help debugging. So I think debugging actually starts with creating clear error messages. Now, a lot of times we're using this verify value. This is a function that you can drag over from your Actions Explorer. And there's a number of parameters. One of them is optional. The first parameter is important, I think, because it's the what that you are comparing. So if you put in a clear statement here, then when you get the error message, it will say you're verifying the value of, that this is stock, this comes with verify value of, and then I put into my what, customer last name. So the message reads verify value of customer last name failed. And then this part just comes from the verify itself, the expected and the actual. And of course, we've got our call stack. We could double click on here and navigate right into the verify. And we have the ability of setting this to true. And if I had done that, above here, you'd see the little camera icon that you can click on so that you can see the state of the application at the point of error. That's why those snapshots are so important, because when we're running a test, you know, we're not there. We're not sitting in front of the console. So we come in the next morning typically, or days later, and we look at the results, and those pictures help a great deal with our debugging, trying to figure out what went wrong. Often when you look at that snapshot, it shows you the state of the application. You're like, oh, okay, that's why this failed. You know, maybe there's a problem with the test itself. Maybe there was a logic error, something like that. Anybody catch my misspelling, Jefferson? I just noticed it. Okay, let's talk about caching. This is very tricky stuff here, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is new to some of you. Caching is can be problematic sometimes. So let me explain a little bit about how AscentialTest works internally. Now, you know about the snapshots that you take, right? You point at the application, you hit Control Shift, and it takes a snapshot. Now, I think most of you know that at runtime, AscentialTest is constantly taking snapshots. Anytime we detect that there was a state change to the application, meaning you clicked on a button, you put text into a text field, you selected something from a dropdown, you moved your mouse, anything that you did would trigger us to take another snapshot. But sometimes, and actually an example that I'm going to show you in a little while that Roke provided, sometimes there isn't a trigger. Like, for example, you might be watching a progress box and you want to see when the progress box changes its shape or goes away, or, you know, paints something new onto it or something like that. There's no user action that's telling AscentialTest that we should be taking another snapshot, unless you're doing a wait until exists, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. If you were, say, doing an is present, it doesn't take a new snapshot. But you can always force AscentialTest to take a new internal snapshot. And the way to do that is to come over here to your Actions Explorer and grab Disable Cache and drag it over and drop it into your test. When you do that, AscentialTest will be triggered to take a new internal snapshot. So this will resolve a flakiness issue where there was a state change to the target application, but it didn't trigger AscentialTest to refresh the current snapshot. Okay, I know I've helped a number of people with this. Likewise, if we are using render text, there's a render cache as well. It's a little different. And again, you can drag this over from here, just clear render cache, drag it over into your step or test. What clear render cache does is it forces the application to repaint. And so if it repaints, then it refreshes our render cache. So there have been times when folks have said, render text is not picking up my text for some reason. The first thing that we always suggest is try putting a clear render cache in front of it. Almost all the time that resolves the problem. It's just that the render cache needed to be refreshed. So these are two really good things to know about, and they're related to synchronization. Which brings me to synchronization functions. We have a couple of synchronization functions. Wait until exist is the one that is most commonly used. Now, wait until exist takes a couple of parameters. The first parameter is what's the maximum of time that AscentialTest should wait before deciding that that window is just not going to come up. And then if it doesn't, it will perform whatever action was specified by the second parameter. And those choices are raise an exception. Now, if you do that, game over, the test halts. Or error, which means log the error but keep going. You wouldn't do that if it was a window not coming up that was critical to your test flow, your transaction flow. In that case, you don't want to continue. You want to raise an exception because nothing else will make sense after that. You'll be out of context. Warning, log a warning, but keep going. None, meaning I'm just using this to synchronize. In other words, you're just using this so that AscentialTest will wait for the window to appear, and then it will keep going. So in a sense, when you do that, it's just pausing or waiting until the window exists. Now, what you should know about is that on a little interval, AscentialTest is constantly taking that internal snapshot. It's going round and round and round, waiting until the timeout elapses, but it's constantly taking new snapshots. Wait while exists is kind of the opposite. This is where waiting for something to go away. I've got a little example, maybe two examples that are going to use both of these together. So waiting for something to appear, waiting for something to disappear or dismiss. This is really important. Is present is not a synchronization function. I've seen a lot of people use is present when they really should have been using wait until exists. Is present does not take another internal snapshot. It's just whatever the current snapshot is. When we developed this, we sort of weren't sure we even wanted to put it into AscentialTest because we were afraid it was going to get misused. But customers convinced us that you needed it. So we did put it in, but we're not surprised that it's misused. Sometimes it's used when you're really wanting to do synchronization. Wait until exists could be used on top-level windows. It can even be used on controls. You can wait for a control to show up because maybe a text field doesn't show up on a application until something else happens. You know, maybe you have to select something from a drop-down and then all of a sudden a text field shows up. Well, in that case, again, use wait until exists. Don't use is present. Is present is only there if you know that the page or the screen is fully loaded, there aren't going to be any state changes to it, then yeah, sure, go ahead and use is present. But again, it's not a synchronization function. It operates only on the current snapshot, and never use is present on a top-level window, never. Always use wait until exists. And if you don't care about raising exceptions, that's fine. Wait until exists with a timer and none, not is present, never on a top-level window. Have I said that enough? Okay. Now I'm going to talk about a tricky thing. And this actually happened the other day with a customer. I can't flip through and see if you're there or not. This can be tricky. This is a situation where, you know, you've got a progress bar. It's going to pop up on your application, and then it's going to sit there for a while your application is doing something. We see this a lot in Power Builder applications, and then it's going to go away. Now, I've seen a lot of times people just do my progress bar wait while exists, and they wonder, why is this not working? Why is this dismissing right away? Well, the reason why it's dismissing right away is because this happened so fast, possibly, that it executed before the progress bar even showed up. So you're almost always going to want to pair these two together in this case. Wait for it to exist. So wait until it exists, give it a timeout. I usually sleep for a second in between. I don't know that that's necessary. And then wait for it to go away. This, you'll be much more successful with this than if you just try to do it by itself. And I think we have an example of this from a customer. Okay, now I'm going to talk about a couple of flaky things that we've seen and how we solve them, and then I'm going to actually show you some that customers have sent in. First thing is a retry loop, and this is a good thing to know how to do. I had a test one time that I was executing against our website, our old website, and in Chrome, there was like this pause. When I went to hover my mouse over the contact menu, which dropped a submenu, it worked fine always in IE and Firefox, but it would intermittently fail in Chrome because there was this weird hesitation. And so what I decided to do was I decided to put a retry loop in there. So, you know, here I only have 2 retries, and I start with my first attempt. And so I say while the information request form, which was what I was expecting to show up when I clicked info request. So while that doesn't exist, and I'm just giving it a second, and I'm saying none, I'm just using it for synchronization. And if my attempts is less than my retries, then I'm going to try to hover my mouse. I'm going to hover my mouse over and try again to click on the info request. And I just gave myself a print statement there. I said, well, it didn't display. I sleep for a second, I increment my attempts, and I go back up and say, did it work? Nope. I'm going to try it again. I'm going to hover my mouse. I'm going to click. Now, in the end, I think what I found in Chrome was that actually if I moved my mouse somewhere else and then moved it back, I think that actually solved the problem as well. But this is what I had done in the interim, and that did seem to work. So that's a retry loop. Now this comes from Neil at Autodesk. So if Neil is there, thank you. His is a little bit fancier than mine. I like this. It's actually recursive. He calls this busy wait, and he has, again, number of retries, and he has a timeout and a Boolean. And he prints his number of retries. He sets his number of retries. He says if it's 0, so he's counting down. He puts in and he counts down. You'll see he does retries -1. So he waits for the busy indicator. And then remember, this is a Boolean. I probably would have made that a B. Busy exists, and he waits. If it doesn't exist, then he just sleeps for a second, and then it will exit. It doesn't go into the else, and if you understand recursion, you know that this will kind of unwrap itself and go all the way up to the top and out. But if it doesn't exist, then he's going to try again. He's going to decrease his retries, and then see, it's recursive. He calls busy wait again. So it enters it again, and again, he's looking for the indicator. So his is a little fancier than mine. It's recursive, but it does kind of something very similar, but I like it. Now, this comes from Pete at DNVGL, so thank you, Pete. Pete had a flaky test. He said that this test was failing about 20% of the time, and he was racking his brain trying to figure it out. It would fail because the menu item was not available in a subsequent step, and this is the way flaky tests always happen. we get, whoops, we get the error not where we, where the error actually occurred. We actually get it on the next step. That's what happens a lot with flakiness, because the application, is not where we think it is. So the test has kind of moved on, but the application didn't. So usually flakiness is that the application is behind in context where the test has gone. He said initially it just was not obvious why the test was failing. So let me try to take you through this. Again, the trace, very helpful, and having the steps I think is a nice thing. And you can see like he was trying to select a menu item, but he couldn't find it. Why? Because he wasn't there. It hadn't gotten there yet. So when you look at this, the first thing is, well, why wasn't the menu item there? It didn't match any objects. Now, of course, if we had a snapshot for that, and I don't think we do it on menus, because menus, believe it or not, are not real objects. If it was a button click, it would have created a snapshot. So, no real clue here. And so what he found was that it had to do with timing. Because what he was doing was, and you should know this, in PB, if you set something on a row, you actually need to click off the row in order for that value to be accepted. So clicking off sort of completes the action. It's kind of like hitting the enter key. And so what he did was he set something on one, and then he always clicked on row 1 to kind of save whatever it is that he did on the. But what would happen is, what if it was row 1? And then he was clicking and clicking again. And so it was being interpreted as a double click. 2 clicks are a double click. And it all had to do with timing. And what he found was he studied the times, and I didn't point this out before, but I should have. The times are all recorded here along with the trace. He noticed that the test always passed if the interval between the 2 actions was greater than a half a second. So if it was greater than a half a second, then it was registered as 2 separate clicks. Whereas if it happened within a half a second, it was a double click. And that would cause the application to do something different than what Pete was expecting. So he figured it out by using the trace, looking at the timing, and then just kind of thinking about his logic. Now, he changed the way he did this entirely. He told me that what he does instead is he actually just reopens the window to save the data rather than just clicking on another row. So he averted the problem a completely different way, but he found the problem by studying the trace. Now, Roque from Climex sent me a number of Flaky tests and their solutions, so thank you, Roque. I'm going to take you through some of these. Okay, this one is kind of similar to what we were talking about before. He's got a progress bar, and so I see that Roque started a timer. So he instantiated a timer and he started it. And he has 2 rectangles. A rectangle is a built-in type to AscentialTest that gives you the size and position of everything. And so he's got the progress bar pause, and then he's got a progress bar indicator pause. And he does a try where he gets the recs, and then he's in a while loop. And he's looking for the width of this indicator to be less than that. So while this is less than that, he stays in the loop. Now the key here, and he keeps getting the rectangle of this one, because the rectangle of this one's going to change, and when it does, then he knows that he can pop out of the loop. So that's how he's doing his synchronization. This is key. Remember I talked about earlier how nothing is going on at this point to trigger AscentialTest to take a new snapshot. Oh, and by the way, I should tell you that I took liberties with everybody's examples. Just for education purposes, I might have changed them slightly just to make them easier for people to understand and easier for me to explain. So if this is your example and you see it, yeah, I changed it. Not that I thought there was anything wrong with yours, but I just wanted to be able to explain it to the rest of the audience. But you see how this is key here. If we didn't do this, this would never change. He'd be here forever. This is important because you need us to take a new snapshot because that will catch the change in this rectangle. And then in this case, what he really wanted was he wanted to get the elapsed time. And so that's what he was doing there. Nice little solution. This one's interesting because he's using is enabled to synchronize. Waiting for something to become enabled. This is something people don't think about. And you notice for this one, you don't need, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. You don't need to do the disabled cache because it's gonna, every time you call it, it's gonna check. And he's got a tolerance again, and he throws an exception if it doesn't happen within a time frame. Oh, this one's very interesting. This is something that I bet a lot of people don't know about. This is called a handler. So AscentialTest has the ability to create a separate thread that will look for something. So this is when an asynchronous event happens during your execution. So you can't actually put the check for this in your test because you don't know when it's going to happen. You need a separate thread to do this. So by creating a handler, AscentialTest basically has another thread that's looking at your application all the time. And you can then create something that will handle the exception. And so that's what Roque did, is he added a handler and he's got this unexpected dialog handler. And so it will look for the unexpected to occur and then what's in his step here, and it could be a function, a step, it could be anything, that's going to then try to close this thing. So you see in this case, he's got a lot of different try catches. He doesn't know what it is necessarily. It could have a yes, it could have a no, it can have an okay, it can have a cancel. So he's trying very different ways of clearing this thing. Because maybe it's modal, and until you get rid of it, nothing's going to happen inside of your test. So I encourage you, if you have asynchronous things that could pop up, go ahead and check the help out for add and remove handler. Anytime you use the handler, by the way, this is a little trick, you need to call it again. Once it's used once, it actually goes away. So you need to reinstantiate the handler. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some new things that are coming, kind of exciting, and then I'll turn it over to questions. So the next version of AscentialTest is getting close, and we've got a couple of other features that we're working on, including this one here. We've been asked for quite a long time to have a debugger, and debuggers are tricky with automated testing tools for a reason, because when you debug a test, whether you're on a local machine or host target, although it's sort of worse on a local machine, when you have a breakpoint and when it sends you back to AscentialTest, it causes a problem because the focus then comes back to AscentialTest, and then when you resume, the focus is no longer on your application; it's on AscentialTest. So unless it was some kind of an action, what can happen is the action could get swallowed by Windows, because like if you were clicking on something, that action might turn into setting the window active. So a traditional debugger is tricky. We did it with the last tool that we created in the 90s. You're probably aware that we're the same people that built SilkTest for Segway a long time ago. We had a debugger and we were never happy with it. So we are sort of putting our toe in the water here. We're going to give you a breakpoint, and the breakpoint will allow you to halt, if you will, at a certain point, at which point you will then, we're still designing it, but I believe what we're going to do is we're going to show you all the local and global variables in a little dialogue, so that you can kind of see what the state of the application is. Now, I don't know if this is going to happen in this release or not, but if it doesn't in this release, it'll happen in the next one. You'll also get a field where you can type in a line. So this would allow you then to put in an action, like commenting everything out and putting in an action in the particular context that you're in. And so then we're going to give you a resume where you can then like go to the next breakpoint or just continue the test. Or if you're just done, you can just abort the whole thing and then go ahead and change your test and then go ahead and do it again. So like I say, there's the breakpoint, and then hopefully the run single line will make it. If it doesn't make it into this one, it'll definitely make it into the next one. Now, before I turn it over to questions, I want to draw your attention to a new subforum that we've created. So if you're not familiar with the Xenix AscentialTest user forum, please go out there and join the forum. There is a number of subforums out there, and this is a brand new one called Ask the Community. And Roke was good enough to seed the new forum with a couple of questions. So the idea here is to get a dialogue going amongst members of the AscentialTest community. And so he's got some questions. What are your most effective tests? How do you tailor your reporting for the different audiences in your organization? So I see there's been some views because I just took this last night, but no replies yet. So hopefully, folks, you'll get out there and start interacting with each other. The idea here is too, you can ask the community if you have a particular issue or problem, or just want to know how they've handled something. This is a good opportunity to do that. Of course, it doesn't replace support. You can always ask us, but sometimes when I get a question, I turn around and ask somebody in the community that I know already did that. Actually, Pete over at DNVGL helped me out a couple times in the last month or so, because he's got an Oracle database, and creating a connection to an Oracle database can be tricky. And so Staples had asked me how to do it. I had forgotten. I went right out to Pete, and he reminded me on how to do it. So here's a direct way to ask the community. You don't have to go through support. You can ask each other. So I hope you'll start using that. Okay, so actually 1 minute early. I always want to try to leave 10 minutes. We've got 11 minutes. So please go ahead now and ask your questions.